There's several other top amendments here that reference this idea. And I'm going to throw out the issue here, should we even be having this conversation? And we'll start here. In 1973, most of you guys have heard of the Roe v. Wade abortion case here. And in this court case, they said that privacy was a right guaranteed in the Constitution, that it was protected here. They've put together a few amendments, throwing in 9th and 10th in here as well. 14th was a key one also. They said that we have privacy, but in the light of national security, I'm wondering, is privacy something that is a qualified right? Is it an absolute one? Is it somewhere in between? Should there be some limits placed on the idea of privacy under the Constitution? So I'm going to throw it over to Ben here. Why don't you start us off here? What kind of right to privacy should we have as American citizens?
Well, I mean, the specifically enumerated rights of the Constitution, and this is basically the difference between right and left on the Constitution. The right feels that the Constitution sets out certain specified rights, and those rights are guaranteed against government infringement. The left feels that there are much broader rights. It depends on which side of the bed Anthony Kennedy woke up on that morning. When it comes to the balance between privacy and security, but you're talking about two roles of government that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Obviously, the government has the authority and the responsibility to protect us, but by the same token, we also have a right against unreasonable search and seizure. So it all falls within what is the definition of reasonable, what is the definition of unreasonable, and when we're looking at things like the NSA scandal and the expansion of the Patriot Act under President Bush's regime and also under President Obama's administration, then what we're looking at is whether the searches that have been undertaken are in fact reasonable or whether they are in fact not. And I guess that we're probably going to find some common ground, I think, on how much of this is reasonable. My feeling is that it's completely unreasonable for the government to have authority to search anything and everything about you in order to stop terrorism. Obviously, there are folks who are on my side of the aisle who disagree with me. I mean, just right after me on KRLA is Dennis Prager, who completely disagrees with me on this. So all rights in the Constitution are to a certain extent qualified. There's no such thing as a perfect right to virtually anything in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has really trimmed around the edges in a lot of areas. As far as a broader right to privacy, a blanket right to privacy, that doesn't exist. There are certain rights to privacy in the Constitution, but they are rights against unreasonable search and seizure, or right to free speech, a right to practice your religion as you see fit. If they wanted to write a blanket right to privacy in, the founders would have done that. Saying that there's a right to privacy that's derived from the 1st, 4th, 9th, 10th, and 14th Amendments, I mean, that's a real shopping list there. And you might as well say that there is a right to freedom that is derived from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, all the way through the 27th Amendment. When you define your terms that broadly, they end up not meaning very much.
What do you think about that, Hans? Let's talk about the right to privacy.
The right to privacy is not something that's spelled out explicitly in the Constitution, but like many things that we celebrate now as liberty and as freedom in this country, it comes from an evolving interpretation of the Constitution and an evolving application of the Constitution and its principles to our everyday lives. I would like to talk about an important case that just emerged today. The president of Brazil is now putting on hold a state dinner planned for the United States just today upon the revelation that her personal emails were not beyond the scope of U.S. penetration and the PRISM program that is now gathering up information on millions and millions and millions of Americans and our phone calls, and that is not beyond the scope of what we would deem basic privacy. Privacy now is not just what we enumerated in the Constitution. Privacy, what we celebrate now, and freedom from government overreach, and freedom in our personal lives and our most basic aspects of selfhood, is now what is protected by a series of precedents, including Roe v. Wade, including some of our precedents from the 1970s around unreasonable government surveillance and unreasonable government information gathering, and the unreasonable use of the government's power of search and seizure to invade our personal privacy. That is a precedent which is evolving, and to take an explicit and narrow view of it based on a rigid notion of original construction of the Constitution not only would lead to violations that we now would find deeply offensive and deeply inimical to the American way, but it has now led to this embarrassing form of international ignominy, if you will, of a foreign head of state now postponing a visit and the important trade that could go on in this discussion because finding her own personal email subject to U.S. surveillance. We are now in an unenviable position of having to examine our are stakes in our privacy debate now, not simply because of its overreach for American citizens, but because of the black eye it's given us in the world. And I hope that we seize today, Constitution Day, as a chance to revisit what is going on in this country involving our privacy, but also to celebrate those precedents that have advanced beyond the bases of finding, celebrating, and elaborating our privacy rights that we have now celebrated in precedents going forward.
We talked about the prison program here, but if you'd like to respond,
I do
go
briefly,
ahead,
if
jump
that's
in.
okay. The word evolution is coming up a lot. No one ever talks about the evolution of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Words in legislation actually mean things, and they don't just mean what you think they mean today. This is why I made a blithe reference to Anthony Kennedy waking up on the wrong side of the bed. In order for evolution to take place, theoretically, that evolution is supposed to take place through the legislative process. And when we talk about the judiciary purposefully evolving the Constitution, that was never contemplated by the founders, and it's not only is it unfair to the electorate, but it's a perversion of what the Constitution itself stands for. So if you can believe in a right to abortion, but that is something that obviously should be done through legislative processes, not because 9 people in robes decided that day that the founders must have left room in the Constitution for the evolution toward abortion. That's more of a systemic question, really, than it is even a political question, which is how much power do you want to give to a branch of government that is unelected and serves for life. When it comes to the blanket right to privacy, again, the question becomes, if you believe that there's a blanket right to privacy under the Constitution that's established by things like Roe v. Wade, then why is it that the government now can access all of your health care information, and the same people who are opposed to the government stopping you from having an abortion are in favor of the government being able to look at every abortion that you've ever had? So these are all questions that really ought to be left to the legislature, and that really is not a political point as much as it is a systemic point.
Okay, and we talked about, you had 2 of my questions you already referenced here, prison and healthcare records. I was going to get to those here. But Hans, let's throw this out to you here. We talked about the prison program, and obviously this already botched a state visit. There is a legitimate point that people bring up that we want to be safe about it here, but the prison program and other programs are searching and collecting massive amounts of data on people here. Whether it's recording phone calls or just tracking the phone calls you made, we're doing this, and we're tracking this information. Do you think that these programs are an unnecessary and unacceptable intrusion on our civil liberties? Or are these just necessary as we have to deal with in a post-9/11 world where people fly planes into buildings?
A very worthwhile question. And I think it's important to both enumerate what the scope of the so-called PRISM program is, that now all Americans are subject to, and also to identify the important role of citizen oversight over government, and to demand that there be accountability to the American electorate and to the American citizens over what is going on in the name of our own safety by our own government. And that is an important principle for Constitution Day in particular. On a day when we celebrate this important document put forward 226 years ago today, we have to remember that the standard for what goes on in terms of data gathering, monitoring every phone call, its duration, all of our phone records, being able to identify all email traffic going on in the country, not just involving foreign parties, but involving domestic parties, that there is an important principle and there is an important issue of privacy at stake in our ability to gain oversight over the scope of that program and to exert checks on the amount of data gathering going on. A basic principle also being violated in that regard, and don't just take this from me or take this as a left argument. This is an argument now joined by the likes of Jim Sensenbrenner, the Republican chair of the Judiciary Committee, an arch conservative from Wisconsin, and the National Rifle Association, who have joined as amici in the brief challenging the scope of the PRISM program. And that it is important to understand that the gathering of data going on all Americans being done in the putative interest of national security is being done by a state which is ultimately subject to our control. And the standard, again, I come back to the issue of a standard. The standard is not, do we have anything to hide? Or the frequent justification trotted out by those defending a program, or whatever scope that program might eventually take on, is not, do we have anything to hide? The important principle at stake is, do we have oversight over that program going on in our name under the putative justification of our own safety? And the answer to that is yes. And when we find ourselves unable to exert check on that program, when we find ourselves even possibly unable to comprehend the scope of that program and its potential invasion of our privacy, we have to revert to that principle, that the principle of disclosure of what is being done, that when surveillance is occurring, that we be alerted to it, and that we have the ability to know when our communication might be subject to surveillance, and that we have the ability to check it and rein it in, and that ongoing data gathering is ultimately subject to our own oversight as citizens. Those are the principles at stake in the PRISM program. Those are the unusual alliances taking shape around a demand for oversight and disclosure about its scope. And those are the national interests and the privacy interests at stake in our ability to check and to rein in the PRISM program.
I mean, I'm very excited to see my friends on the left suddenly discovering distrust of federal government. When it comes to, obviously, the government gathering information, what we've been told by both the Bush administration and by the Obama administration is basically trust us. President Obama said on Jay Leno, there is no such thing as domestic surveillance. That clearly was not true. There is, in fact, domestic surveillance. He also used the excuse that there are FISA courts, secret surveillance courts, that are overseeing a lot of this. That's also not true. There have been 56,000 emails that were drawn without the permission of the FISA courts, and for a 3-year period between 2006 and 2009, the FISA courts actually had ruled against the NSA gathering some of this information, and the NSA continued to gather the information anyway. Now, the argument in favor of the NSA doing all of this, gathering the information, is they don't really care whether you're about to have dinner at the local bistro with your mom. They're not really they're not looking into that. But the problem is that there are a lot of things that the government has shown itself willing to look into that should frighten every citizen of good intention, whether it is the IRS targeting particular people, which is something that has spanned, again, both Democratic and Republican administrations. JFK did it, Nixon did it, Clinton did it, now Obama does it. Or whether it's looking at this administration targeting journalists, as they did with the Associated Press or James Rosen at Fox News. The question as to how much you trust the government is really the key one here. And when you think about it, you shouldn't just think, do I trust Obama or do I trust Bush? I think a lot of folks on my side of the aisle made the mistake of thinking, we trust Bush, and so we'll go ahead with the Patriot Act. And didn't foresee that it would. I was back for the Patriot Act, and didn't foresee that it would blow up in the way that it would, and we should have. We should have thought to ourselves, okay, well, President Bush, maybe we trust him on national security. Perhaps we don't trust President Obama on national security. And the reverse is true, too. If you trust President Obama, you should also think how you're going to feel if it's President Rand Paul on the other end, or if it's President Ted Cruz on the other end. So when it comes to the powers of government, it's a sword to be wielded by both parties, and so we have to be very careful about how we give that sword. Now, it is important to recognize that the right to privacy in this area is not absolute. The NSA has to do something in order to target folks, but what we've seen on a consistent basis, whether it was the shooting at the Washington Navy Yard or whether it was what happened during the Boston bombings, there are always red flags. It is almost unthinkable for there to be a terrorist incident or a mass shooting where there are no red flags of any sort. And that's why we sort of sit here and we're puzzled at the fact that the NSA is gathering all this information at the same time they're missing the Russians warning us about the Tsarnaev brothers, or missing the fact that the Navy's own Veterans Administration was giving mental health care to the guy who just had security clearance to the Washington Navy Yard and then walked in and shot 12 people. The fact is the government is not real good at this stuff, which means that their powers should be circumscribed. It's my view that they actually have too much information to even keep track of the stuff that's important. They're distracted by the vast wash of information that they're being given. Now, we've been told that certain terrorist attacks have been prevented. I'd like to hear about those terrorist attacks so we can at least hear the other side, as opposed to just a generic, well, we know that we're stopping terrorist attacks. The truth is that a lot of the terrorist attacks that have been stopped in the last few years have actually been stopped by citizens, whether it's the Christmas Day bombing, where there was a guy who was attempting to, Abdul Muttalib was trying to bomb a passenger airliner into Detroit, and he was stopped by fellow passengers on the plane who didn't want to see another 9/11. Or there's Richard Reed, who was also stopped by fellow passengers on the plane. Or even whether it was the CIA stopping a plot from Yemen, which again was only stopped very, very, very last minute. All of these things, there are red flags attached, and it is my view that one of the reasons that you're seeing blanket surveillance in this way is for the same reason that we have blanket surveillance at the TSA. It's the same reason we all have to walk through x-ray machines. We all have a general idea who is to fear, or at least we should have an idea who is to fear. Not all people are created equal along these lines, and I don't mean everybody has equal rights, but there are things that are certainly, we'd be fools not to recognize that certain people, their activities make them more suspicious than other folks. And so if you don't believe that, then you have to believe one of two things. Either there should be no surveillance of anybody, or there should be surveillance of everybody, right? Because if everybody is equally suspicious in the eyes of the law, then what is the government going to do? If you want them to protect you, they have to surveil everybody. If you don't want them to protect you, or you think that the civil liberty is the most important thing, then they should not surveil anyone. So either we have to find a way to distinguish between apples and oranges, or we're going to end up with a blanket regime of surveillance or a blanket regime of no surveillance.
I think there's a great question here, Ron, that you probably want to talk about civil liberties and how Ben brought up, we have to surveil everybody or nobody here, and that there are other liberties that might be infringed upon, depending if we have a lot of selected surveillance.
Well, I'd like to applaud my fellow debater here on the recent skepticism of conservatives and their use of broad federal powers and usurping other forms of control of the democratic process. Because unfortunately, the path down which our federal government has gone was paved during the early Bush administration. And when we talk about the risks or the people who are justified sources of fear or of opposition, it is anyone who proposes a policy that begins with the phrase, notwithstanding any other policy or provision of federal law. That kind of broad, usurping language that sidelines other policies, that runs roughshod over other precedents involving privacy and checks on government authority, was paved during the early Bush administration, and the panicked and ultimately hand-fisted response to 9/11. And unfortunately, the dangers of the Patriot Act, which Ben acknowledged, were paved by those broad overreaches of federal law that were paved by executive orders of the Bush administration and by the language of the Patriot Act. One of whose paragraphs now, number 215, is the basis for this broad coalition of interests gathering together from the ACLU to Jim Sensenbrenner and the NRA, saying we have to understand what is being done under the PRISM program, and we have to have legitimate checks and restoration of confidence that the Congress actually is empowered to rein in that program under its role of oversight. So we have to understand what caused the problems that we are facing now in policy, and that it was the panicked response driven by a bullying conservative approach to our federal legislative process, and that we are now in a position to exert a coalition-based oversight over that kind of broad federal overreach, which is leaching into everyone's what we might have considered sacrosanct communication. And just as Ben indicated, I think we're very much agreed on this point, that the flood of information now at the hands or fingertips of law enforcement at many levels, and that's a problem in itself, and that we are having law enforcement without the proper training, without the proper certifications, without the proper discipline, with their hands, shoulders, necks, heads deep in a pool of information drawn from surveillance and drawn from wiretapping and other forms of surveillance that is not able to be assembled into meaningful, actionable law enforcement work. It's not able to lead to profiles. It's not able to lead to crime inhibition or into the detection of actual criminals. What am I calling for? I think some of you may remember the leadership of FDR in a previous era of crisis around international threat and a perception of menaces coming at us from foreign powers. And in the response to that era, one of FDR's maxims, which I think has stayed with us and provides a useful touchstone to this era, is that we have to save big business in the case of his maxim. We have to save big business from itself through appropriate federal oversight. Well, in this instance, we have to save the concept of interdiction and law enforcement from itself. And just as Ben indicated, that the best forms of intervention and prevention of terrorist incidents have occurred through one-on-one and human-led intervention and from law enforcement involving individual sources and actionable tips. That the flood of information now gained from surveillance is not going to prove actionable or helpful to our long-term security goals and our security strategies unless it is reined in and unless civilian oversight over that process is exerted, to the point that what is netted from appropriately limited and targeted scopes of surveillance worthy the threat and under the appropriate oversight of the FISA courts and other proven checks on the unreasonable extension of that authority, is that it will yield surveillance and intelligence that can actually drive better policing, better law enforcement, better interdiction of both domestic and international threats. That is what's at stake here. And so those who would argue for unfettered access to Americans' private communication, whether it be by the telephone or by electronic means, need to understand that we are not in this for a complete evaporation of that capability, but it does need to be limited, it needs to be strategic, and it needs to be driven by an understanding about what actually fuels safety and our domestic security, which is the ability to inform well-trained law enforcement personnel based on the ability to intervene with appropriate intelligence.
I mean, we actually agree on policy. I mean, we do. I just think that it's interesting that politics begins ex nihilo, with the Bush administration, as opposed to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act being passed by a Democratic Congress during the Nixon administration, and you citing FDR as a civil libertarian despite him interning 200,000 Japanese folks. So, the fact is that the history of surveillance and the history of violations of civil liberties goes back a long way, and all the way back to Lincoln, who was suspending the rights of habeas corpus during the Civil War, and up through and including the Wilson administration in the early 20th century, which was routinely imprisoning people under the Sedition Acts. I mean, if you really want to go all the way back, you can go all the way back to Adams, who was trying to imprison people under the Alien Sedition Act. So this has always been a question in American policy. It's obviously reached new heights in light of the fact that all of our communications are so easily available to the government, and that's a result of technology. It's a result of the immediacy of technology and the availability of technology, and it's also the result of a threat that is in some ways different because of that technology. In many ways, a terrorist threat that is in many ways different from what the United States faced in 1800 or 1918, or faced even during the FDR years. What we're facing right now is obviously a very diffuse threat, and that means that the government, is in order to protect us, is going to make the case that it ought to have access to a broader swath of information. I understand that case. The problem is they're making the case that they ought to have access not to a broader swath of information, but to the entirety of all information in the United States, which is a wild overreach, and something, frankly, I don't trust people who are bureaucrats at the federal level to do. These are folks who are federally licensed DMV workers.
Nor should we trust bureaucrats at the state level.
I agree with that, too.
Because one of the important issues that is a correlative to our federal debate right now, and this debate about data gathering, is that we are also seeing efforts to make massive invasions on the privacy and on what might be deemed the civil liberties of students in a variety of contexts. Imagine yourself applying to this college and being told that upon arrival you would have to pay $50 and be subjected to a whole battery of drug detection exams, whose results could then be used to determine your fitness to stay enrolled here at Citrus College, and could then be part of your transcript and be part of your law enforcement record, such that it could end up disqualifying you in the hands of any number of future employers, or be passed along to any number of future teams, churches, other parties seeking your transcript or seeking your record. That may sound a little bit cuckoo. Unfortunately, it is exactly what happened just these last 2 years at Lynn State Technical College in rural Missouri. And just this week, a federal district court had to tell Lynn State Technical College that it could not conduct such a massive, all-encompassing sweep of drug testing of all of its students, and asking them to pay $50 for the privilege thereof, and had to refund that money and had to stop this battery of sweeping drug tests. Why is that important? because the same kinds of arguments that we're seeing at the federal level, or the same kind of debates that we see around massive data gathering and intrusion on Americans' privacy, have an effect in that they can induce other state agents or private agents to act in a way which is violative of those same principles and our same interests. And so we have a stake in stopping those overreaches when we see them, even when they are on realms that we may not comprehend or easily wrap our hands around. We have to insist on our ability to understand their scope, to research and disclose their scope, and to check them, because unless we do, they leach into smaller scale invasions of privacy that can have sweeping implications on our ability to proceed with an education, to get jobs, and to enjoy a civil life in this society free from the taint of judgment or of unwarranted investigation. That is what's at stake.
Well, actually, this will be fun because now we'll actually get to disagree. The taints of judgment, there's nothing in the Constitution that frees you from the taints of judgment. Certainly not of others. And when it comes to, you know, this is a very extreme civil libertarian position, that the idea that when the government notifies you that it wants to do a check on you so that you can exercise a certain privilege, and you don't have a right to attend a state facility for college. There are certain conditions that go therein. That's why not everybody can walk on. They actually have tests that you take in order to get in. They have an admissions committee. When it comes to all of this, this is where you end up with the problem of the Aaron Alexis's, right? Because what Aaron Alexis, obviously, they background checked him, and they didn't catch this. Well, the case could be made that they shouldn't have had to background check him at all. If the idea is that we're not going to violate his civil liberties, you have to be free from the taint of judgment, then how could we possibly take a look, for example, at his mental health history, which is the most private of people's medical records, especially given the fact that we knew that he was mentally ill and that he had several misdemeanor convictions in various jurisdictions around the country. Background checks, I think, for particular, I mean, and here I do sound like the liberal saying that background checks, you know, arguing for background checks under certain circumstances. Background checks to exercise not a right but a privilege of working for the Navy, a privilege of having a security clearance to get into a Navy base, a privilege of attending a college. The checks on that basis are a far cry from the idea that the government, without notifying you, is actually going to go into your private emails or go and take a sample of your biological material. These are not the same thing, and I would urge a distinction there that I think is incredibly important. But again, I think that goes to an even more basic distinction between rights and privileges. That and this is a big distinction between right and left. The right actually sees that distinction between rights and privileges on a much larger basis. The left tends to believe that a lot of privileges are rights and a lot of rights are privileges, and therefore if you're exercising either a right or a privilege, then you should be exempt from any sort of background check or any sort of surveillance at all.
It should not be left to the American Civil Liberties Union of Eastern Missouri to articulate and to defend a basic principle, which I believe most Americans share, that a blanket drug testing policy is not a standard for qualification, much less one that you should pay for to enter a technical college in this country.
How about like a blanket criminal background check, like for misdemeanors?
That's not what's at stake here. What's at stake here
Why?
is a access of a student to an education. And when you start imposing tests like that, and when we start winking and nodding at the ability of an unchecked local state university, or when those of us in California might be prone to believing that what happens in another state at a small technical college does not hold any potential risk for adaptation or adoption in our own midst, we fall victim to the problem of believing that these principles, because they may seem obvious to us and because we may hold them dear, or we may extol them in our families or in our institutions or in our churches or in our other civic lives, that because we take them for granted or hold them dear, that they are somehow outside of threat and beyond the scope of ongoing challenge. This is a problem that we need to check now and prevent it from happening again. I don't believe, and nor do I believe that people on the left or right of principle would seriously consider a blanket policy of drug testing that could be used to disqualify you from gaining a community college degree or a state degree should be used as a basis for allowing people to access the on-ramp of education.
How about a blanket policy of checking your intellectual credentials? I mean, you have to submit. I mean, there are many things that are relevant to getting a college education. Moral character is one of them. When I took the bar, and I'm a lawyer in the state of California, you actually had to. They did do a background check on you. You actually have to have acquaintances write into the state, and they have to write in that you're a character reference. So my question is, where do you draw the line? Because you're arguing against a college being able to do a drug test on you, but I assume that you're okay with the SAT, the ACT, or at least some measure that would distinguish one group of people from another group of people, some people who get in from some people who get out.
I'm going to stand with the reasoning of the district court in Missouri, which held that this blanket drug policy, which unfortunately drew its impetus from the kind of invasions of privacy which we see encroaching at other levels of our democracy, is inimical to the American way, and it's unfair to students, and especially in asking them to pay for it. It may be appropriate to have drug testing, as the district court found, when it comes to seeking a degree in aeronautics or in gaining pilot training. There are very limited degree programs in which a blanket drug testing may actually be allowable and permissible. But as a blanket policy for the entire student body, with that data not subject to any checks on its applicability or transit, who can access it, how it can be tainted, how it can taint the life of a student going forward, or a subsequent application they might make to a different institution, much less an application to a job or a charity, that is what is at stake in this debate. And I think it's important to understand that when something is invoked, like national security, or our desire to keep our students free from substance abuse, or our families free from the threat of addiction, that even those noble goals have limits on their ability for public agents to impose tests that curtail our privacy rights and set standards that are inimical to the American way.
Let me jump in here with a question. Both of you have referenced it here. Aaron Alexis shot 12 people at the Washington Navy Yard. And we have those deaths that are coming and the tragedy that's happening here. We both talked about we could have better checks of his record. We could have checked his mental health status here, which has been the last 2 months he's been receiving treatment. We've talked about how we don't want to invade civil liberties here, but we have to admit the fact that there are 12 people who are dead because we didn't. Now, I'm not endorsing it per se one way or the other, but if we go back to Barry Goldwater, who ran for president well before we were alive, thank heavens, I feel better about that here. Talked about the idea here, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. That he would go after, and I think argue for, extended background checks. We can agree with the Ben Franklin quote. We talked about the idea of giving up essential liberty to obtain temporary safety. We've had that negotiation. But on the flip side, Goldwater makes a very interesting point here, that if we're going to, and if he were here today in 2013, he'd say if we're going to fight a war, we're going to fight it. We have to push, push, push here. What do we do with these kinds of situations where we have people that can have mental health issues, can go buy a gun, and get onto a secure facility with a background check that apparently didn't get checked, didn't get bothered here? They can tap my phone knowing whether my wife and I, what we're having for dinner tonight, but we had a guy with a gun kill people. What do we do to make the society safe? Can we make it safe without infringing upon the liberties that both of you guys tend to prefer, at least to one degree or another?
I think it's important to identify specific points in American democracy where our ordinary system of policymaking has broken down because of the inordinate influence of particular lobbies and their ability to hamstring the debate and to stop what we might agree on as common sense policies. We saw, after a series of gun violence tragedies, this latest in Washington, a city that I called home. I know that area extremely well. I know that neighborhood. I know a family member of one of the victims. I have watched these gun violence tragedies, like all of you, both aghast and with a degree of mourning, and also with a degree of mystification. That there are common sense policies involving background checks, involving keeping guns out of the hands of criminals, involving repeat magazines and the limitations on them, involving law enforcement who often find themselves outgunned by criminals in their attempt to check them or prevent them or bring them down in the case of the shooter outside the temple in Wisconsin last summer. We cannot tolerate these series of violations of what we, again, might call the American way without identifying the problems with the democratic process that stem from the inordinate power of particular interests, in this case, a gun lobby, to deny even the interests of many gun owners and the ability to have reasonable checks on magazines, on access to buying weapons, and on things like trigger locks. Though these are important principles that, as it was seen in the Hate Crimes Act, which unfortunately, simply to extend provisions of the Hate Crimes Act in gathering statistics about how many people of different backgrounds were killed or subject to hate violence in this country, it took 29 years to pass that law covering gender and sexual orientation, simply because of the prevalence of an anti-gay lobby which dug in its heels on the issue of intolerance and prevented a common sense data gathering from taking shape. This was not even interdiction, this was data gathering. And then it took 19 years more, from 1990 until 2009, for the president to be able to sign the Hate Crime Statistics Act, the James Byrd and Matthew Shepard Act, which extended the ability to gather statistics involving gender-related and sexual orientation-related violence, also disability-related violence. It is important to see that we have a political system that in some cases is choked and will not, and at least at this point, is not responding to the will of the people and common sense demands for enacting reasonable reforms. And so when Ben places inordinate faith, and when he reverts to talking about the legislative branch as this vaunted means that's supposed to solve all of our policy problems, we have to remember that sometimes our legislative process is broken, deliberately broken by some interests who have an interest in keeping it stagnated or broken, and that we have other branches of government that have a responsibility to weigh in and apply our Constitution and other values and policies in a way that can sometimes check or take the role or fill the vacuum where the legislative process may be broken.
Well, the demonization of the other side is quite tiring. The idea that there is some vast lobby out there that magically controls all of the strings of Congress is quite conspiratorial, considering the fact that there are lobbyists on every side of every single issue. And anybody who's ever been to Washington, D.C. recognizes that everybody on K Street represents every side of this issue. I mean, the fact is that just as there were people who were lobbying against the Hate Crimes Act, there was a large group of people, largely from the gay community, who were lobbying for the Hate Crimes Act. Just as there were people who were lobbying against the Supreme Court decision with regard to California and gay marriage, there were groups that were lobbying on the other side in favor of that decision. The lobbying business is not really the discussion, because the lobbying business has been around since the founding. I mean, there's nothing new about lobbying, there's nothing extreme about lobbying. I'm annoyed by lobbyists, I'm annoyed by the ties between big business and big government, just as probably more than folks on the left who are happy to see the President of the United States pick winners and losers on the economy. The fact is that when you look at the legislature, the reason that I put a lot of stress on the legislature is because the legislature was created as the most representative branch. It is the most representative branch, it is the most localized branch, it is the largest branch by far in terms of the number of people who actually sit there as elected officials as opposed to regulators who are unelected and sit in the executive branch, or the folks in the judiciary who have to be approved at the federal level by the Senate. The fact is that for a group of people who are civil libertarians to call for what would really be tyranny of the minority, to call for the executive branch to enact laws on his own in complete contravention of the Constitution, or to call on the Supreme Court to override laws in complete contravention of the Constitution just because it's what you feel like and so you agree with the Supreme Court doing it, is a perversion of the system. Now, when it comes to gun laws, then everybody, I think that it is nasty, and I've seen a lot of folks do this, to suggest that people who disagree with you on gun law are doing so because they don't care enough about dead people. That's a nasty thing to do, it's inaccurate. Everybody in this argument cares about people being killed. The question is, how do you stop those people from being killed in the first place? And all I ask is that folks on any side of the aisle provide actual evidence that the policies that they are suggesting will work. Now, when it comes to universal background checks, as a general principle, I'm for them. The problem is that universal background checks generally have not worked. California does have universal background checks. When you come to this particular guy was background checked by the government, and he went ahead and he shot up the place anyway. Which is why when you're talking about specific gun control measures, you have to look at whether the gun control measure is going to be effective. Because unlike situations with drug tests, when you're looking at a situation with the right to bear arms, that is a specifically enacted part of the Constitution with a named right. Now you're talking about violating the rights of people who have never broken the law without any reasonable search and seizure, without any criminal background, and without any suspicion that they've actually done anything wrong in the first place. Here is the way that you actually enforce law, because this is how cops do it. They look for red flags. This is true on terrorism, it's true on crime. When you see red flags, take away those people's guns, make sure that they never get a hold of guns, make sure they don't have access to Navy bases. We are a society that, if you want a free society, then you have to have a society where you rely on the folks that police themselves to a certain extent. You know, as they say in New York, if you see something, say something, right? I mean, this idea, which is very trite, is actually quite true. If everybody likes to point out that AR-15s were used in Aurora, Colorado, and AR-15s were used in Sandy Hook, and AR-15s were used I don't think they were used in the Sikh situation, but there was an AR-15 that was used in the Portland shooting. And the fact is that there's another common factor here, which is that every single one of these people had a severe history of mental illness, which was never reported, and they broke a significant number of laws in order to obtain the weaponry anyway in most cases. In this particular case, an AR-15 was not used. When the media was reporting that it had been used, the argument was that they were actually reporting that the guy had taken a shotgun, blown away somebody with an AR-15, and taken the AR-15. So if you're going to enact a policy that actually works here, maybe a policy that would actually work, especially given military bases, is we all seem to be comfortable, and you hear President Obama talking about, we don't want military-grade weaponry in the hands of non-military people. We want military-grade weaponry not in the hands of civilians. Well, how about military people having control of military-grade weaponry? When Nidal Hasan can walk into Fort Hood and kill 30 people because there's regulations on the books put in place by President Clinton from 1993 that you can't carry a gun on a military base. When you have those in place, it makes it real difficult to stop somebody. As it turns out, gun-free zones are gun-free except for the people who decide that it's not a gun-free zone. It makes it very difficult to actually defend yourself in a gun-free zone when you're the person who's paying attention to the sign that says gun-free zone, as opposed to the guy who walks in with an AR-15 and a bunch of different rounds. When we talk about the police being outgunned in the main, you're talking about people who have broken gun law already. Because the vast majority of the time, North Hollywood shootout's a good example. I live just down the block from where the North Hollywood shootout took place. The criminals in that case had outgunned the police. None of those weapons were legally obtained. They changed all the weapons in the first place. So look, I'm happy to talk about universal background checks the minute that the government actually gets good at universal background checks. I'm happy to talk about the government taking all of these measures the minute that I see proof that they will actually work. I mean, the fact is that the state with the lowest amount of gun violence in the nation per capita is Vermont, which has virtually no gun laws. And cities like Chicago, which have tons of gun laws, of course, have an extremely high rate of gun violence. So you have to look at a wide variety of factors. And then let's talk about what works without demonizing the other side, without just shouting about the gun lobby. There are a lot of good reasons to oppose various laws. And by the way, if we're going to talk about the hate crimes law, it's amazing that you're okay with the federal government doing a thought policing experiment where they're supposed to get in the heads of the people who are killing. You mentioned it's called the James Byrd and Matthew Shepard Act. There's a new book that's coming out now that is reporting that Matthew Shepard was not killed because he was gay. He was killed because he was a meth dealer, and one of the people who actually killed him was his gay lover. So that is not an excuse for the killing of Matthew Shepard, but you can't get inside folks' head. A murder is a murder is a murder. They're all evil, and there ought to be punishments for them. And so it's amazing to see that that some folks on the left want the federal government not to be able to read your email, but they want the federal government to somehow divine what was in somebody's head when they shot someone.
The folks on the left and the right actually agree that when there's hate violence in this country, it actually sends an important and unfortunate signal upon anyone who happens to share certain characteristics that actually warrants particular efforts to mitigate and stop hate-related violence. And so the importance of doing measurements, mere measurements about the range of violence committed against different groups of people in this country is an important function of a state government and of a federal government. And the effort to gain statistics about hate violence, notwithstanding any calumny directed at people who are no longer here with us and able to defend themselves, which unfortunately is an imbalance in our system of debate, it's an imbalance in our legal system, and that unfortunately renders verdicts like we saw in the Trayvon Martin case, where people who are not alive to defend themselves unfortunately can't speak up. But in the instance of the policy we're talking about, the gathering of statistics around particular forms of violence directed at groups of people, whether it be because of religion, whether it be because of race, whether it be because of sexual orientation or gender identity, and I would note that religion-based hate crimes sexual orientation-based hate crimes, and racially-based hate crimes continue to rise, and that those statistics are a valid basis for evaluating whether our work in community relations, whether our work in a whole series of other public policy areas is functioning and is making progress. And so when you try to diminish the value of gathering evidence, when you try to diminish the value of gathering data about what crimes of hate-related violence are occurring, you're actually putting your head in the sand about problems that we still have with regard to diversity in this country and equal access to opportunity and the Constitution's guarantees of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
One final thought, guys. I know our time is short, and thank you for being patient here in our audience. I'd like you to suggest for me one way that we can help to maintain or improve security while still preserving privacy. I started with Ben in the beginning, so I'll start with him, and we'll finish off with Hans here to finish off our conversation for tonight. What can we do to balance the two, if possible?
Behavioral profiling. I mean, that's what we all do in our daily lives. Every single person does it every single day. We all profile each other based on what we do, whether we want somebody in our house. That's not based on you doing a full criminal background check of everybody in a 5-mile radius. It's based on you actually meeting the person and deciding whether they're a serial killer. So behavioral profiling is the answer to this. It's a very individualized approach to all of this. And the government is going to have to undertake behavioral profiling. Now, the reason they're not doing this is because they don't want to be seen as being politically incorrect. They don't want to be looking at certain communities more than other communities. They don't want to be looking at certain practices more than other practices. They're afraid of being sued on that basis. They're afraid of all that. And so we all have to pay the price in terms of going through those turnstiles at the TSA and having the government make the case for checking all of our emails. Because if we can't check just one email, then we have to check everybody's email. So the way that law enforcement has always been conducted has been with regard to behavioral profiling. Now, that entails its own risks. There's no question about it. But there's a slight difference between what we're doing in the terrorism field and what we've been doing traditionally in the law enforcement field. Traditionally, law enforcement is responsive. Traditionally, law enforcement responds to actual incidents of violence. The police don't arrive until someone gets shot. Here, we're trying to stop somebody before they shoot. So to a certain extent, we are going to have to look at difficult questions balancing those issues. And I don't want to act like this is all easy and that there will never be violations of privacy. But unless we're willing to take some sort of balance, and I think that it's a balance that should weigh heavily in favor of civil liberties as opposed to security if we can. But unless we undertake some sort of balance, we're either going to have to go all the way in one direction, which is what we currently have, or we're going to have to go all the way in the other direction, which is the full civil libertarian kind of Ron Paul position, which is that the government should have no power to surveil anybody, and there should be no sort of behavioral profile. There should be nothing, basically. Until somebody does something, you can't respond. That's all well and good until 9/11 hits, at which point the entire country cries out, why didn't we stop it?
What do we do, Hans?
Education. One reason why I was so passionate about standing up for the access to education unfettered from blanket drug testing and the violations of privacy that it imposes in the case of Missouri is that education is the best on-ramp to national dialogue, to unity, to community cohesion, and to the inhibition of resorting to violence to solve problems. One reason why I am a passionate advocate for exploring and celebrating the life of George Brown, local congressman from the Imperial Valley, grew up in very humble circumstances down in Holtville, south of the Salton Sea, down near the Mexican border, in what is still referred to as the carrot capital of the world in Holtville, and who went to junior college, graduated from UCLA after World War II, actually was originally a conscientious objector to World War II, who, when relegated to a camp in rural Oregon, decided that that was not a way to change the world, but to actually enlisted, became a lieutenant in the Army and served in World War II, came back, finished his degree at UCLA, ended up starting a career in public service in the 1950s, became a leading advocate for educational access here throughout the Inland Empire, throughout the greater Los Angeles area, because he deeply believed, and his own experience proved to him, that when people were given access to an education, it inhibited their willingness to resort to violence and force as a means of solving problems, and that they began to show curiosity, engagement, and long-term cooperation with each other around business, around forming organizations, around labor, and around all manner of other civic affairs. And so the life of George Brown is an important touchstone not just for what it says about inland Southern California. It's because he extolled and he really worked for throughout nearly half a century in public service, from what I call the age of Sputnik up to the internet age, for access to education, for junior college, for K-12 education, for junior college access, and for a pipeline into higher education that students of all backgrounds could access. George Brown, as you probably just gleaned from the story, was no big advocate for the armed forces, even though he was a veteran, even though he served in World War II. But he really diligently fought for young women and young men of color and their access to the military service academies when they were facing disproportionate rates of denial in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And so here's a man who, as a peacenik, as a peace-loving person, devoted his career to ensuring that people had equal access to education, whatever form or direction that education could take them. So when it comes to looking at these issues around preventing violence, around celebrating our Constitution, defending civil liberties, and extending recognition and respect for privacy, education holds a key role in that. So it's very important for us when we see anything that would endanger students' access to an educational on-ramp, that we pay particular attention, or we particularly scrutinize whatever kinds of barriers are being thrown up to students, and that when we can lift those barriers, it is not just a victory for students, it's a victory for the American way, and it's a victory for all of our goals of inhibiting violence and inhibiting the use of force as a ready means to solve problems.
Ben wants to say something here.
Well, I'm sorry to say this at a college, but I'm not going to sign on to the Educate Osama plan to stop terrorism. I don't think that education is the solution to people doing evil, bad, horrible, immoral things. I think that generally speaking, people who are moral tend to care more about their kids' education. And basic math or reading the latest poem from Maya Angelou is going to make somebody less likely to kill somebody. I think that the people who read Maya Angelou poems are less likely to kill somebody to begin with, which is why they're reading Maya Angelou. If we're gonna talk about actually stopping these problems, then we're going to have to look to deeper societal ills than access to education, especially because in the United States, for all of its massive flaws, and the public education system does have tremendous flaws, everyone does have access to basic education. Beyond a certain point, that is certainly not true, and the public schools have significant problems. But there are value problems as well that have to be looked at in a very real way. And I think that papering it over with the idea that if we just let more people into college, that will somehow tone down the violence. Bashar al-Assad was somebody who was highly educated in Great Britain. We've seen massive numbers of terrorists who have been highly educated. We've seen doctors, we've seen lawyers. It really comes down to values. Good people don't commit crimes. Bad people commit crimes. It's not about just uneducated people uneducated people commit crimes. Correlation does not equal causation. There are rich people like Bernie Madoff who are highly educated and have a lot of education who commit crimes, and there are poor people living in the inner city who don't commit any crimes. Morality crosses all class boundaries. Morality crosses all racial boundaries. Morality crosses all age boundaries. And to suggest that there is just a magical cure-all, which is give everybody a scholarship to Citrus College, I think is a mistake.
To describe any effort to increase the pipeline of students and any effort to lower the barriers to gaining an education, much less a higher education, especially now with the crushing burden of debt that many students are encountering and shouldering in order to gain access to higher education, that it is not Pollyannish to demand that be accessible and that we respect and invest in that on-ramp. Because the best investment in stopping violence in our communities is not throwing more and more money into surveillance and into acquiring more and more access to the private communication of Americans. The best interdiction of violence in our communities is an educated populace that's able to meet, to discuss, to stand for public office and to be leaders in the community, and to craft solutions to problems that are responsive to that community's needs. That this whole process of democracy depends on an educated citizenry. And so to depict any effort to improve education, to expand and support our public education, and to lower the barriers, including indebtedness, to students being able to gain access to higher training and advanced degrees is not Pollyannish. It is essential to the American way, and it is essential to the American experiment. And when we talk about a Constitution Day today, this 226th anniversary of our founding charter, the oldest continuing written charter of any country in the world, it's because we have been able, over the generations, to read, to know current affairs, to learn, to conduct free enterprise based on our learning, and to have hope that our ability to work together in our communities actually can translate into policies that we can govern ourselves by. That is the essence of the American experiment, and it relies at its very core on access to education as a means of American self-government.
Okay, guys, it is 5:25. I love this conversation, but these two guys probably have to get to homes here. Are there any questions? I'll take a couple of questions here, and we'll get going. Yeah, right in the back there. It's recognized. Yeah,
James.
James, that's right. Yep.
But I have a question.
It's my Thursday class. I know he's here now. Go on.
All right. I've been writing things down since you've been talking, both of you. Now about morals, does America have a chance to legalize prostitution? It's just I believe it's a moral thing rather than a political thing like a law.
Does America have a chance to do it, or should America do it?
I don't know, like,
There's normative
would it
questions.
happen anytime? It's saying that all the other countries have, or that, and
Why don't we jump on the idea of prostitution or marijuana, things like that, things that are usually considered morally questionable? Should we move toward legalization of those practices since those are private decisions?
I've come out in favor of legalization of marijuana and heavy regulation of it the same way that we do with cigarettes because that's been highly successful with cigarettes.
Just
and with
try to get
alcohol.
into Lynn State, though.
What's that?
Try to get into Lynn State.
Well, I mean, when it comes to what standards colleges use to let people in, that's really to a certain extent their prerogative. When you take a look at prostitution, that depends on your view of prostitution. I don't buy into the glossy view of prostitution that it's just a bunch of women selling their services to make a buck. I think there's a good deal of sexual exploitation taking place. If you look at the actual practice of prostitution, you're seeing a lot of underage girls who are being forced into the trade, and you're seeing a tremendous amount of violence against women in that trade. I'm not for the legalization of prostitution specifically because of that.
Okay, excellent question. Thanks, James. Let's get another one here. Get one more. Hey, we'll get Daniel and we'll try the third one up here.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I have a question. When President Bush had the Patriot Act enacted after 9/11, the Republicans and conservatives were all for it, and loved it, and the liberals were all against it.
I mean, it's not really
That's
true.
not true.
Actually, a lot of liberals
Well,
were
for
for
the most part, okay?
That's the public perception.
Actually, a vast majority of Democrats voted for the Patriot Act.
Okay, then you turn it around back, and now it's like President Obama has his own NSA thing going on, and most Republicans are against it, but now it's switching, where the Democrats are for it. And what blows my mind is, why can't they both work together and get some common sense on what will work and what won't work, and who the surveillance and who not the surveillance? Because a lot of the American people are looking at the politicians like, you guys are a bunch of goddamn dummies.
Well,
You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's
Sorry,
common
go ahead.
sense.
That's just it. What are you thinking about that?
The problem is not the political stance of the office holders so much as it is the lack of accountability for the procedures being done by government agencies that defy the check of the executive or the check of the legislative branch. So part of what is so unsettling and part of what is so infuriating to many of us, regardless of our orientation on the political spectrum, is that what seems to be happening is going on through what you might call a monstrous security state, and by apparatus of the government using tax dollars to conduct this massive surveillance without the appropriate check or without the appropriate instruction from either the executive or from the legislative branch. In fact, many people in the legislative branch, left and right, again, I come back to Jim Sensenbrenner. This is no liberal. This is no woolly-headed Wisconsinite walking around in Birkenstocks. This is the Republican, conservative, anti-immigrant chair of the Judiciary Committee who is outraged by the scope of government surveillance going on with U.S. tax dollars and the evasive answers that people from the NSA and elsewhere have given to his oversight bodies and panels when called before the Congress. So what we are looking at, again, I come back to George Brown. This is a man who, when faced with the challenges of the 1970s and saw what his colleague Frank Church from Idaho was doing, looking at the FBI's massive surveillance of Americans and the use of that intelligence to discredit people, to infiltrate organizations, to sow distrust amongst various organizations. Even someone who just won the National Medal of Freedom, Dolores Huerta, will talk about the danger and the massive amounts of government intervention in the United Farm Workers throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, and the distrust that it sowed of colleagues, and the very unstable relations that it created within the UFW and its ability to manage its own functions. That is not a bygone episode. And George Brown, looking at that problem, looking at the problem that we see again today of the FBI going beyond its charter and gathering massive amounts of information on Americans, not subject to checks on where that information might be used or the way in which it might be bandied about to discredit various Americans in a subsequent appeal, campaign, or political forum. That it is a danger that needs policies to respond to it, and we have to demand of our lawmakers that they step up, whether from the right or from the left, because as you can see from Ben's and my argument today, there are points of remarkable convergence on this issue that we need to take full advantage of. And as with the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in the 1960s, toughened with the creation of open government laws and the post-Watergate era in the 1970s, which George Brown was a protagonist in doing, and in the FISA courts, which have been functioning in some ways very well, but have been undermined by some of the recent practices, especially since the Patriot Act and the use of secrecy to actually evade the jurisdiction of the FISA courts. We are seeing misuse of the security state apparatus, and we are seeing it not responsive to our office holders or even to the executive. This is not to let President Obama off the hook, but it is to outline the scope of the problem we are facing and the potential for people of different political ideologies to come together and to demand not just disclosure, but appropriate limitations on that being done with our tax dollars in our name and for our putative security.
To me, the real reason why you're seeing so much partisanship on a wide variety of issues is because what we've seen is a massive, tremendous growth of government that's been bipartisan in nature. And what that leaves people with is a feeling of confusion as to how the actual government works. Nobody knows how the government works. And so the way that we tend to view the government is as a car, and we see the president as the driver of that car. And so if you're somebody who likes President Bush, and you think he should be driving the car, then you're willing to fill up the tank with gas. And if you're somebody who likes President Obama, then you're willing to fill up the tank with gas. If you're somebody who doesn't like Bush, then you're going to siphon it off. If you're somebody, I do think that on one side of the aisle is slightly more, worship of particular political figures. I mean, I went to the DNC, last year, the Democratic National Convention, and the psychosexual God worship for President Obama was relatively disturbing, all the way up to and including a sand statue of him. But beyond that, what we have seen, and this is a tremendous problem that crosses party lines. This is really not a party issue. When you have a government this big and a presidency this powerful, when you have an imperial presidency, which is a phrase from Arthur Schlesinger, a liberal, coined during the Nixon administration, and that's true regardless of the president, then people tend to either be for or against the president as opposed to for or against his policies. And that is a continuing problem in American governments that is not going to be cured until we dramatically slash the size of government, and the president, instead of being in the great leader mold of what the president should be. This is Woodrow Wilson's creation. Woodrow Wilson was the first one to really talk about, and he bought it from German progressivism. The idea that there was the president was not just supposed to be an administrator, he was supposed to be the great leader, forging a vision for the United States, embodying the public will. I mean, these are his words from his own writings back in the early 20th century. We bought into that the president is the guy who runs us, right? Or as Chris Rock said, he's like our daddy, right? And he's supposed to be somebody who actually, runs our lives. And until we get beyond the idea that there is one person, regardless of how much you trust him, that ought to run our lives, we're not going to be able to cure this. And forgive the vulgarity, but government on both sides of the aisle has been baffling us with bullshit. I mean, they've been telling us for a long time that the size of the government is such that nobody can understand this except professional politicians from either party, and that's why you see that Bush and Obama are really not very different on a whole hell of a lot of policies. Whether you're looking at the growth of government, or whether I mean, Obama has done it vastly outweighing Bush, but President Bush grew the government at a fantastic rate as well. Up till President Bush, nobody had grown the government as fast as President Bush. And up till President Obama, nobody had grown the rate at nearly the rate that President Obama did. When the government is this big and we don't understand it, we just say, okay, put that guy in charge. And now that he's in charge, I trust him. Because we make decisions about the people we vote for, not even about the policies that we vote for. We do it much more based on image, whether we like them, and whether they're someone we'd like to have a beer with. This is why Obama's personal approval ratings remain incredibly high, and his policy approval ratings remain incredibly low. If you look at his policy proposals in Syria, for example, there's a CNN poll. It says 61% of Americans agree with President Obama's policy in Syria. 60% of Americans think America should not be involved in Syria. How is that even possible? Right? That's just because they like Obama, but they don't even know what the hell he's doing because they like Obama. So until we get beyond the point of a government this big, then we're not going to be able to rein it in any way, because most people don't spend that much time on politics. Most people are not like me. Most people are not like you. Most people take 5 seconds on politics at the beginning of the day to read through just the front page, and usually just the top headline, and then they move on to the sports section and the rest of their daily lives. So with the government that's unwieldy, run by this many experts, this regulatory government with literally millions of employees, 4 million people in this country have top security clearance. Okay, that's a government that is wildly out of control.
One last question I have over here, and I want to get gentleman over here because we've been waiting for him.
Real quick, I'm the Vice President of Young Americans for Liberty. Thanks for coming, appreciate it. I'll like your opinion, I guess different opinions for the subject matter. Basically, we had a vote today in student government to condemn the NSA's actions. As student government, we took a vote. Despite almost 400 petitions from different students around the campus, they voted 9-3 no against our petition.
Voted what? How again?
9-3 against us to condemn the NSA as a resolution as a whole. I was wondering what your opinions were that, because we were kind of like, what? So, one of your opinions were on
that actually is a perfect segue to what I wanted to respond to the last question. And just as a playful aside, I would note that the majority of the outsized venerated images on Mount Rushmore happen to be Republicans. So
Because it's the Republican administration when the Mount Rushmore was commissioned.
But that's beside the point. That's just being playful. My point, though, is about advocacy organizations and the value of civic organizations like the one you're engaged in. Just because this effort around fostering opinion and debate and marshaling students' input on a petition was not successful in swaying student government leadership, I would hope that you not go away, because, especially in light of what Ben was talking about people's sense of mystification at the government and at governance, that it is important for people to be involved in organizations which transcend party. That's one reason why I think it's very important that people look at the American Civil Liberties Union, that people look at organizations like People for the American Way, or organizations that advocate for civil rights, for civil liberties, for education access.
Got any on the right there?
And I'm sure there are a few. But the importance of what you're doing in working in coalition with other students and to bring policy positions forward, spurring debate as you go, and of informing people about the student governance process itself, much less the local governance process, the fact that you have state lawmakers here, a member of Congress, 2 U.S. senators, one of whom lives out here in the region, that is a very important, and in some ways, even more stable form of ongoing advocacy. That you can stay involved in that, stressing principles that are dear to you, that are dear to your family, that speak to your background, or that speak to your immigrant heritage, or your ethnic heritage, or your religious background. Those are very important organizations to be involved in. I happen to know the founder of Young Americans for Freedom, a man by the name of Marvin Liebman, who founded the organization back in the 1960s and gave Ralph Reed his first job in politics.
Young Americans for Liberty, not for Freedom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. But it's a
different one by Jeff Fresno.
They grew out of the same root, actually. They grew out of the same root. And it is important to be involved in nonprofit civic engagement activities like this, because regardless of the regime, regardless of the president, regardless of your political background, and sometimes you may find yourself in agreement with people who come from a different part of the political spectrum than you in these organizations. And that is, I guess, what I would say is a parting thought, which that a student in a class like this 30 years ago in doing a term paper, came up with an idea, resurrected from history, that ended up leading to the most recent amendment to our US Constitution, the 27th Amendment. How many people can name what the 27th Amendment says?
Come on, other than Gerhard.
The 27th Amendment,
Compensation for members of Congress.
that's exactly right. It involves the members of Congress' ability to vote on pay raises for themselves.
It took 200 years to pass.
It took 200 years to pass. Why? Because a student in a college class found that this dormant constitutional amendment stalled for, at that point, nearly 200 years, and a conservative, put it forward, and ended up driving around the country, faxing his heart out, back when fax machines were the cutting edge of communication in the late 80s and early 90s, and ended up securing passage of this bill, of this amendment, to limit members of Congress' ability to vote themselves pay raises between an election. In other words, under the constitutional amendment, the 27th Amendment, no member of Congress can vote for a pay raise that would be in effect within that term of office. So they have to at least take the gamble that it would take effect after the next election, at which point they would face the voters and face the accountability, presumably amidst debate over the fact that they'd voted themselves a pay raise. Now, I say that to highlight the value of research and the value of work in organizational contexts, to bring issues to the fore, to work in coalition with other nonprofit organizations, and to continue to voice your beliefs and sentiments in coalition with office holders at whatever level of government people may happen to occupy. It is an incredibly valuable exercise, and if it encourages you to end up taking that next step and running for office, especially in a state as diverse as this one, which has more than 6,400 elected positions at all levels of its government, I would encourage you to take that step. We need principled, diverse people from whatever political background you have, because these problems have proved solvable in the past, and no matter how inscrutable and how difficult to wrap our arms around some of the issues involving safety and privacy we've discussed today, they ultimately are manageable and solvable through the democratic process. This system of constitutional government, which we put in place 226 years ago today, actually has proved remarkably adept to handling crises at repeated episodes in America's past, and it will prove able to solve those problems, given educated, well-informed people of principle stepping forward to serve an elected office and work through organizations and work through coalition to solve the problems today.
I mean, I certainly agree with that call to action, although I do wish that student had focused on the 16th Amendment instead of the 27th. It would have been good to repeal the income tax. As far as the question that you originally asked, which was why would the student government, despite being civil liberties minded, vote 9-3 against voting this down, I can do this in 3 words. You ready? Obama's a Democrat. That's why they voted it down 9-3, because this is a college campus, and President Bush is no longer president, and that means that anything that Barack Obama says and does is going to go over well. And this is a problem for all of American politics, that we ought to be looking at the policy as opposed to just looking at the party on the label. When it comes to the system of constitutional government, just to wrap up, we have to, I think that it is vitally important to look, and it's easy to discount the founders, it's funny that on Constitution Day, we talk about what really perfected the Constitution was a bunch of judges living 200 years after the Constitution. It's not the case. The constitutional system that was put in place, of course it had flaws, but the system itself, the system of legislature, judiciary, executive checking each other, the system of federalism, states checking the federal government checking the states, the system of enumerated rights and limited government abilities, all of that is vital to your freedom. And our movement away from that is what has caused the massive growth of government, ranging from the government injecting itself into your health care, to the government injecting itself into your retirement, to the government injecting itself into everything about you. I mean, the government now knows every dime that you make, it knows how you spend those dimes, and it knows what emails you're sending in order to spend those dimes. So that government could not exist if it were not for the perversion of constitutional government, particularly over the last 100 years, and largely due to well-meaning folks who just thought that the system couldn't work. The truth is the system could work. It's just that they disagreed with the result they were getting from the system. The first person who really discussed changing constitutional government in any major way was Woodrow Wilson, who said that the Constitution was basically obsolete and it needed to be replaced. And that is the view of a lot of folks today, who continue to insist they're not replacing the Constitution, they're evolving the Constitution. There's no other piece of legislation in American history that people would suggest ought to be evolved. But the Constitution needs to be evolved by people who just know better. There are no people who know better. You're the people who know better. Get to know the Constitution, get to understand what the founders were trying to do, get to realize what vision of human nature they were putting forth. Not a vision of perfectible man at the hands of government, but a vision of people who could be good and could be bad, and who needed to be checked by each other in order not to do anything truly heinous. That is the vision of freedom that our founders put forth. It's a vision that's just as true now as it was 200 years ago. That's why we're celebrating Constitution Day. And that's why it's vital that if there are going to be defenders of liberty, they're going to be the people in this room, not the people sitting on the Supreme Court, and not the people sitting in the White House, and not even the people sitting in Congress, at least not until we decide to vote out the people who disagree with us on the basic principles that undergird the liberties that we rely upon.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. Let's give a round of applause to the guys. The Young Americans Foundation does have a table in baptism applied if you'd like to pick up the literature. If you're in my class and didn't sign in,